Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, it is just a regular day because I want to talk about a book that I read. So stuck in the mindset of Short Story Tuesday and Poetry Thursday. But often I just want to talk about a book that I read. And do I have a doozy for you today? This one is about sex, romance, and the British elite, the British upper classes around 1920. I am referring to Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was written by D.H. Lawrence and published in 1928, but not really given a wide release until 1960. For those who don't know, D.H. Lawrence was a British writer who lived between the late 1800s and the early 1900s. I don't think he really had that much time to sit on this book and enjoy its release until he died, because I think he died in 1930. So this book was published like 2 years before his death. And even then it was only published like in small circles. I think because he understood like what was in this book would not have sat well with the audience that he aimed it at, but as well as just general like decency at the time, what people thought was decent and whatnot. But yeah, he wrote quite a number of books, often focusing on taboo topics like sex or romance or relationships, often describing like incestual ones and whatnot. Talking about women's liberation and feminism, although a lot of people have noted that his feminism does seem a bit superficial, and I'll talk about that later in this video. And so ultimately, like a lot of people have said that he was kind of ahead of his time, but also he still fell into the traps of misogyny and racism of the time, which again, you do see a little bit in this book. But he was still a somewhat acclaimed writer. And he wrote he wrote to his peers at the time who liked him, although near the end of his life, a lot of his friends kind of left him. Some people have argued that he was a fascist, which I do see in his writing. Others have said that it's kind of superficial and leave you wanting more kind of thing. But there's also been some praise for it. So very mixed opinions of this writer during this time. In 1960, this book was given a wide release, and it immediately was subjected to an obscenity trial, although I think it managed to beat it. But D.H. Lawrence was long dead by that time, so mainly it was just the British public at that time saying, "Gadzooks, this book is so dirty and smutty," and it would have probably been given like the same treatment in 1928 when it was written. If it had been given a wider release. So I can probably understand why Lawrence didn't do that. But without further ado, let's talk about this book, as I do have quite a bit to talk about. This was a very interesting book. I will do a brief summary, a little bit of an analysis, and we will move on from there. So Lady Chatterley's Lover focuses primarily on Constance Chatterley, otherwise known as Connie or Costanza, depending on where she's at, what she wants to be referred to. She has a sister named Hilda, and they come from a very well-to-do family who were given quite a lot of liberty in kind of Victorian era England, near the end of Victorian era England. They went going through all of Europe, and they eventually found some gentlemen who were German that they fell in love with and had a great time with. But unfortunately, World War I happened, and they had to leave them, and those men died during the war. But at the same time, she met Clifford, who came from the upper elite of the upper class of British society, and they managed to fall in love and get married. But unfortunately, Clifford was paralyzed during the war and was left in a wheelchair throughout the rest of this story, which I have to praise Lawrence for not not quite like being ableist in this story, noting that Clifford still has control over much of himself and is still the same person and still able in many ways, even if he is paralyzed. So I do have to like praise him for that, even if he does say some weird things as well. And so like Clifford and Connie are married for a little bit, and they're not quite in love. I think Clifford loves Connie, but Connie begins to see like through Clifford, realizing he's not a very good writer. His friends are all terrible, and his opinions are kind of bad, and she doesn't have that physical love for him anymore, mainly because he's paralyzed from the waist down, and during that time at least they didn't really have the technology to make sex happen. So like there's an unhappy marriage going on, at least on Connie's part of things. She ends up having an affair with a visiting writer named Michaelis, who I feel like is a stand-in for another writer. I'm not quite sure who, but it's clear that both Lawrence and Connie don't like Michaelis. At first she has a relationship with him and she falls in love with him and things seem to be great. He tries to encourage her to leave Clifford, but she doesn't quite want to do that. And ultimately she begins to see through his writing and realize that it's kind of superficial. He's only interested in himself. And although she would be interested in pursuing something more and leaving Ragby, which is the manor where she's at, Michaelis ultimately ends the relationship, which leaves her changed and very unhappy. Although at the same time, Clifford announces that he wants a child, and although he can't provide it, he's willing to approve any affair that Connie has as long as it's with the upper class of society. And it seems that he thinks that the marriage can work if she's cheating on him, but Connie doesn't seem to care. She just wants that approval, I think. Connie begins to grow thin as he feels that her relationship with Clifford is becoming parasitic. He just won't stop relying on her. He's constantly afraid that she's going to leave him, which he's kind of right, but he doesn't really know that. Eventually they get a Nurse Bolton, who takes over a lot of Connie's duties, and it makes her feel so great, and she's able to travel about the manor and not have to be so close to Clifford, who she doesn't like at this point anymore. Eventually, Connie meets the gamekeeper, Oliver Meller, who she develops a friendship with, but then starts to have sex with, which is described as phenomenal for her, a very physical relationship that she's not getting from Clifford, or even like the intellectual side of things with Clifford, and she's absolutely happy, but not telling Clifford in the process, eventually hoping that she'll have a child with Oliver and be able to leave Clifford for Oliver. But meanwhile, Clifford seems to be renewed with Nurse Bolton, becoming less of a shadow of his former self, although he is still very much that. Has a renewed interest in his mines and takes an interest in leading that sort of thing. Although Lawrence notes that there's like a discrepancy between what the workers want, the workers' rights and stuff like that, and him as the bourgeoisie mine owner who is trying to take away all the rights of the workers, which is only making them mad and also making Connie mad because she believes that he's being a real blowhard and making everyone in town have worse lives in the process. Clifford begins to suspect about this relationship that's going on, but he never voices it, and I don't think he's willing to accept that it's happening. So it's deep down in his subconscious. But Nurse Bolton knows, and she doesn't say anything because she kind of likes Oliver. And what's she gonna do? Spread gossip? That's not really who she is. But Oliver, meanwhile, feels like he's being used, and this leads to a big rift in Oliver and Connie's relationship, where he thinks that she's just going to leave him, and she's just using him in order to deal with the fact that she doesn't like the relationship that she's in. She could leave Clifford at any point in time, but she's not doing that, and that's very telling for Oliver. And Clifford and Connie again begin to get at odds, eventually resulting in Connie just deciding to leave for Venice in the process, telling Oliver that she'll return and be with him, although Oliver notes that she doesn't have to leave for Venice at all. She could just go with Oliver right now. Connie asserts that that's just not possible because she has to make it look like a big to-do. And then while she's in Venice, she finds out that she is pregnant, and she decides that she wants to keep this baby and be with Oliver. But she also learns that Oliver's scandal because his ex-wife comes back and finds out that he's been sleeping with someone she doesn't quite know who, begins spreading rumors, and this means that Clifford is going to have to fire Oliver because he can't afford to have the scandal at Ragby, and eventually, like, Oliver goes to London, and Connie leaves Venice to be with him and talk with him about things. And Connie manages to convince Oliver to be in a relationship with her, although he asserts that they are no good for each other and that maybe love isn't even possible in the age of capitalism, which is just a weird way of saying he probably doesn't want to be with her. But eventually, they establish that they can be together. So Connie tells Clifford, who flies into a giant rage, asserting that he would have been fine if the person was in the upper class of society. But Oliver is in the lower classes as a gamekeeper, and thus is not worthy of Connie, and thus, like, Clifford isn't going to divorce Connie, and so he's kind of stuck in this way about things, and they end up having to leave and go to a farm in the process. And so the story sort of ends at that point with Oliver writing a note at the end of the story, noting that he feels a sense of doom for what's coming to humanity. Kind of prophetic since it's like the 1930s and, there's still a war on the way. But Lawrence couldn't have known that, or could he? But he's also hopeful for his love for Connie and hoping that it can produce something good down the road. And that's about where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is quite a lot to talk about with this story. D.H. Lawrence packs it so full of interesting ideas, interesting themes, some things that are kind of half-baked, some things that don't quite work. But it's amazing what he writes about at the time that he wrote about it. And I'm gonna dive right into it. The first thing I want to note is Connie and Clifford's relationship. One thing, I think the characterization is pretty good. I do think he could have been a bit better with Connie in establishing who she is as a character, but I think he does a pretty good job. And talking about like what they wanted and how they fell in love. Like initially they fall in love because of they're upper class in society, and they decide that they have common interests, and there is a sort of intellectual bond between them, as you see in the story. So initially their romance is full of love, but it does seem changed by the accident that happens in the story. Clifford becomes paralyzed from the waist down, and the narrator notes that he's fallen into a shadow of his former self. He especially notes that he no longer allows himself to feel suffering. Like he is incapable of feeling that emotion. He's blocked off certain emotions, which is absolutely not healthy for him. And as a result, I think Connie has taken that as like because he won't voice his feelings or voice what he's really thinking at that time. Like Connie doesn't like him. In addition to being part of the upper elite of society who are so far up their own ass they can't see anything, which Connie definitely notes. Like Clifford's friends are insufferable. Like these emotions, this stunted emotional growth or something like that, or this reversed growth, or not growth, but this reversion, it's made him kind of worse for the wear. So I do like that he doesn't specifically note that it's simply the paralysis that makes Connie not like him. It's more so that he doesn't seek any help. Like, he doesn't acknowledge that, hey, I need help with what happened in my accident. I need to talk to someone about it. Maybe that's not really what could have happened during the 1900s, especially early 1900s in England. Therapy wasn't that widespread yet. But if he's not talking about it, that's going to severely impact their relationship. And so what's interesting is that Clifford does believe that an affair can bring something special to the relationship. It can allow them to have children. They don't have to acknowledge that an affair ever happened. And they can move beyond it because he presumes that there is love there. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. "There's no point in a disintegrated life. If lack of sex is going to disintegrate you, then go out and have a love affair. If lack of a child is going to disintegrate you, then have a child if you possibly can. But only do these things so that you can have an integrated life. That makes a long, harmonious thing. And you and I can do that together. don't you think? If we adapt ourselves to the necessities and at the same time weave the adaptation together into a piece with our steadily lived life, don't you agree? And I find that quote to be very fascinating because it suggests that Clifford knows that he can't provide everything for his wife, whether it be the sex thing or the child thing. Like, it's simply not possible with the technology at that time. And so he's more than willing to have an affair as long as it can keep their relationship together, that is not going to interfere with their love or their life in any sort of way. And I honestly think that could have worked. Polyamory works all the time. Not all the time, but it does work a lot of the time. Like, people manage to make polyamorous relationships work in some sort of way. But that requires that all the parties in the relationship be healthy, that the initial relationship be steady and in a place where both parties are comfortable and trusting with one another and especially like one another. But the problem is these people aren't in love. I don't think Clifford actually likes Connie. He sees her as something to be controlled. Especially says that near the end of the story. But Connie no longer loves Clifford. Like, that's been ruined. He's so emotionally stunted and so broken down and unwilling to look inward and ask for help and acknowledge how he doesn't know everything in the world, and he especially doesn't know women. That turns Connie off majorly, and it just it establishes that there's no love there. So there can't be an affair because it doesn't work with what Clifford just said there. It's not he says it's not going to interfere, and it's definitely going to interfere because there's inherently no love in this relationship. But ultimately, I think all the problems in this relationship, in Clifford and Connie's relationship, are explained by why she likes Oliver. He's willing to listen to her. He provides an intellectual challenge to her. He sees women as somewhat equals. And more so than that, he's willing to provide a love for her and be a gentle lover, presupposing that women feel during sex too. It's not only for the man's pleasure. Women are allowed to have pleasure too. And based on what Clifford says and based on what Connie feels towards Clifford, he's not providing any of that. And so I really like how Lawrence provides Oliver as an example of, why she's cheating on him in the first place. It's very clear based on everything that Oliver is saying why she's chosen him. Another interesting thing about the story is I think to some extent D.H. Lawrence is talking about women's liberation, which is a pretty radical idea for the 1930s. Connie is coming into her own through sexual exploration in this story. She's discovering what she wants in a relationship and the power that she can have over her own body, and the ideas of she's allowed to have an orgasm too. That sex is not just for men's pleasure. I do think that this is about a woman gaining power and a woman coming into her own in that way. And there's definitely an element of pointing out that men aren't doing so well in this story through Clifford for one, but also Clifford's friends, showing that men kind of really don't know anything. The things that they're saying about women and how they don't trust or they can't be with women or love is for the dogs or something like that. And they clearly don't understand women, and if these are the people leading society, then they're not doing a very good job, and they're not doing it for everyone involved. It's really critical of the men in the upper class, and you can understand why this would be controversial. I understand the obscenity trial for the sex, that this is very graphic at times, especially for the 1960s and 1930s when this was originally published. But it also says a lot of controversial things about the British upper class. They're clueless, they don't know how to satisfy their women, they don't know that much, and they're arrogant, and they're part of the bourgeoisie, which is oppressing the mining workers, the proletariat. And I can see how maybe you'd want to ban the book for that reason too, especially given that this is probably his target audience. D.H. Lawrence probably wrote for the elites in society, given what else he has written. But despite that it's about women's liberation, I do think it still has the male gaze. And what is the male gaze? I said that in my TBR video. What does that even mean? And I think it's at times he focuses on the man too. This story is called Lady Chatterley's Lover. Not just Lady Chatterley, it's about her lover, even though he's a side character in this story. The writing is obsessively focused on the penis or the phallus at times, and like it focuses a lot on the man getting his satisfaction. And I know he's critical of that, but it also seems like by focusing on this so much, he's framing women's liberation as through a man's eyes. And that's a problem. So despite the work that he's done here, it still doesn't quite hold up in a lot of ways. I also like how D.H. Lawrence has written about class differences here. I certainly didn't expect to read about class differences in a book about what is ostensibly, about sex, about a romantic relationship. It's kind of like, oh, here's a bit about sex, and here's also reasons why the proletariat should rebel. And I thought it was a little bit funny, but the class differences are interesting because one example of that is Clifford versus Oliver. Clifford is part of the upper classes, and Oliver is part of the lower classes. And I think they both have a doomed view of humanity, where Clifford thinks that ultimately it's up to the bourgeoisie, the owners, to oppress the proletariat because they need to be guided. He's like, there's a speech that is pretty fascist in nature. And I do have to wonder, what Lawrence's intention is, and I'll get to that in just a few moments. But on the other hand, you have Oliver, who is proletariat, and he believes in supporting everyone. He also has a doomed view of humanity, but I don't think there's any optimism for him. It's just men have to evolve and change, or else society will collapse in on itself, which is kind of that sort of older generation, these young children today, they're ruining everything. And given that Lawrence was 60 at the time he wrote that, I can understand where that's coming from. So you also have talk about industrialization in this story, specifically with Clifford wanting to convert the mine into producing electricity and whatnot, and how there's a lot of talk by the narrator about how this is society is being brought down by industrialization, potentially making the men worse. There's also talk of communism and how it's up to the proletariat to return or to pick up Bolshevikism or communism, and use that to get in a better place in the world. But again, Oliver says that that's not really going to help humanity in the end. I don't think that it seems like we're all ultimately doomed, which is very negative. Who would want to be in a relationship with a guy who's so negative? That is my question. And ultimately, when Clifford and Connie are arguing, she says that these people are suffering, we all are. And I think that's really interesting, because she's pointing out, the proletariat don't have it so good, but also the elites, they might have their money and whatnot, but they're in the same boat. Humanity is getting worse off, and, they're not going to be saved by their money at times. So maybe highlighting how, there's ultimately no difference between the rich and the poor. And if you want to say the poor can't have a relationship with the rich, like Connie and Oliver, maybe you're ignoring humanity in general like that. There's no, being rich doesn't make you different from a poor person. It just makes you have more money, which is not a difference in humanity. It's just a difference in how you obtained your cash. But again, it is unclear what exactly Lawrence's intention is with this, because at times it seems like he's on the side of the proletariat, and other times it seems like he's siding with the rich and saying that the proletariat need to be ruled, or else they're just going to wander aimlessly and do something bad. And I'm not really sure, I'm pretty sure he believes this. His writing is pretty consistent throughout the story, and I think it's suggesting that he might be a fascist. I'm not 100% sure on that. I don't want to just jump to that conclusion. I have based this on what I've read, but I would say that maybe 15 years down the line, he would have sided with the Germans during World War II or something like that, or he'd have written something that would have been a reason for cancellation, or us to be critical of him and not really talk about his books after the fact. But there's a lot of weird, unusual things, and it's unclear what his true message is regarding class differences. And then there's other things in the story, such as powerful emotional writing, that I feel Lawrence has at times, specifically with Connie's frustrations, her growing anger. And then when Clifford finds out that Connie has been cheating on him and is pregnant and won't be coming back to him, like the breakdown that he has is just, like, despite the fact that he is a terrible character at times, you really feel for him, like for his world to come down and for that thing he didn't want to acknowledge, like to finally be something that he has to acknowledge. It really hurts. And then also the raunchy nature of this book with the descriptions of sex. I do think that adds a good element to this story, a very human element of the story. I think he writes sex scenes particularly well, even if it is obsessively focused on the phallus at times. But yeah, like people needed to hear this at the time. We need to talk about sex whenever possible because it's a thing that happens, and we shouldn't be ashamed as a society to talk about sex, because that'll just make worse things happen when sex crimes happen down the road. And I also, as I've said before, I do like that this is critical of the elites of society, noting that, you know, like they're too not blind, but too like focused on themselves to see what's happening around them, and they might be making society worse. I do think that's a message that should be said in any age, not just in the 1930s. And then there's other things that don't hold up so well with this story. The problematic writing, where he says some pretty racist, like anti-Semitic, sexist, misogynistic things, maybe some ableist things here and there, like anything. I'm sitting here reading this and being like, please, Mr. Lawrence, don't make me hate you. I want to enjoy this book. And here he is, like a ghost from the past, just writing all these really terrible things sometimes. And it really makes me understand why so many of his friends left him, or just people straight up said, this dude is a fascist. This dude is a nationalist, and he's not doing a good job of accurately writing about these sorts of ideas. So yeah, the writing was somewhat problematic at times. I understand we can't cancel him in death, but we should acknowledge that the writing it leaves a lot to be desired at times. And I also think that Lawrence tends to drone on and on and on, often repeating himself at times, which is unfortunate. I feel like you could cut down on a lot of the story. It's 300 plus pages long, and Lawrence chooses to spend a lot of it just repeating the same thing over and over, as if your readers have forgotten what you told them 20 minutes ago. And that can be a bit annoying at times. And I do think the ending is a bit weak. I like the sort of optimistic, sort of pessimistic take on the ending, but to make it just like a journal entry that Oliver is writing, from his perspective, when we really hadn't heard from anyone but Connie and Clifford throughout the story, it feels a bit weak to me. I feel like there could have been a much stronger ending, like Connie telling Clifford that she's leaving and leaving him emotionally broken, and then that's where you end the story. You don't need to focus so much on Oliver or the farm, as that's kind of a weird epilogue that doesn't need to be there. But I don't feel like it overall hurts the story. I just feel like you could eliminate it and you wouldn't be missing much. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. A very good and fascinating look into sex, women's liberation, feminism, class differences, and English society in the 1920s, 1930s. It's a pretty hard read at times, given sometimes that his writing is so weird. But ultimately, I think I'm better off for having read it, especially being exposed to all of this controversial kind of stuff. I feel like anyone could benefit from reading a banned book like this, or a book that's been through an obscenity trial, because it ultimately lets you know why people would want you to ban it, or would want to ban it in general. What radical ideas is he talking about here? I think that's important to understand. So I'm going to recommend it to you out there, although I will note that he can be up his own ass sometimes, much like the people that he was talking about, kind of not looking inward when you think about it. But anyways, yeah, if you read this before, you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Let's have a discussion about D.H. Lawrence and this book. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this book if they don't know about it already. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and sexy travels. Farewell.